Welcome back. Technology argued with me. Anyways, where were we? Oh, the professor wants the kids to tell him everything they see. It's like the biggest game of I Spy. I want you to tell me all that you see, even this close to winter. You'll be surprised how much color there is. In the town, there'll be shops and rooftops, flags and curtains and bright lights, traffic signals, balloons, the colors of cars, and the clothes people are wearing. Are you still imagining that I have green hair? Good, your imagination's strong. In the country, there will be color in the leaves and flowers and trees, under the hedge groves, by the wayside in the grass. He pointed to the ground. Ben, look closely here. See the earth between the blades? See how rough and hard it is after the frost? Think of being as small as an ant down there. Look at it as if you were indeed a beetle or a worm. Wouldn't the earth be different to you then? Wouldn't it be a whole new countryside? The lumps of clay would be mountains, and the blades of grass would be a forest. Ben stared at the ground. To his amazement, he saw what the professor meant. I never thought to look at it that way before, he said. He was completely fascinated. The professor slapped his knee. Well, that's just my point. Nobody thinks to look. He turned to Lindy. Tell me what you see in the hedgerow there, Lindy. Do you see anything beyond that opening in the branches? Can you see how the shadow on the grass makes it look as though there's a path in there? And that it might lead somewhere exciting? Lindy looked at the hedge carefully and concentrated hard. The light and shade played strange tricks on her eyes. There was a shimmering quality to the afternoon, and her head felt a little fuzzy. It seemed to her as though the hedge began to move, to twist into a different shape like a tunnel. She leaned forward, mesmerized. For 1 second, she was convinced that if she could just go through the tunnel, she would come out into a new and unknown land. She was so excited that she looked up at the professor to tell him about it, and as she did so, the spell was broken. What is it, Lindy? The professor watched her keenly. Lindy turned to look at the hedge once again. She frowned because the illusion wasn't there anymore. All she could see was the green hedge in a perfectly plain winter garden. That's funny, she said. I thought that... She stopped, aware that the boys were staring at her. Well, it's not important. I guess I let my imagination run away with me for a moment. The professor looked at her thoughtfully. Then he turned and walked onto the lawn. Come and look over here, he called. I want to show you something. The children followed him. He moved to the small clump of chrysanthemums that Lindy had pointed out earlier. He picked a beautiful white one on a thick green stem. Look at this. See how sturdy it is? A flower that blooms this close to winter has to be strong. He handed it to Lindy. Ben shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I think flowers are a bit sissy for a boy. The professor moved his sneezewort and picked him up. Let's go inside and I'll show you something that just might change your mind, young man. Have you started science in school yet? We began that last semester, sir. Good. Bring that flower with you, Lindy. The children followed him as he climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the small white door. I'll have you know, he said as he unlocked it, that I allow very few people in here. Very few indeed. He stepped aside to let them through. They gasped when they saw the room. Ben felt as if he had stepped into a small paradise. Look at that telescope, he said. Where are all those lights? Tom asked. That's a model of a problem I've been working on. The professor moved over to it. It's made of special fiber optic glass which allows the light to shine through in such an interesting way. It's good, isn't it? Oh, it sure is. Tom sounded almost reverent. The professor took the cover off a large microscope. This is what I wanted to show you, Ben. This is called a binocular microscope because you look through it with both eyes. Give me that flower, Lindy. She handed him the chrysanthemum. The professor carefully removed a single white petal and placed it under the lens. Look in here now, he said. This should make flowers a little more interesting. The children took turns and each saw something that resembled an aerial photograph of a river with many streams feeding into it, a latticework of tiny, interconnecting tubes. Those veins or tubes carry energy to the cells in the petal. See what happens if I put a drop of ink into the stem of the petal? See how the blue circulates through every little vein? That's just how blood circulates through your bodies. Lindy made a face. "Ooh, I don't like blood. It's gross," she said. Well, that's a silly remark. Blood carries nutrition and energy and food to every part of your body. So instead of saying gross, you should be saying, how wonderful. The professor turned to the boys. "I want to make a point and I want you to learn it well," he said. "I know there are times when things seem rather boring to you or not worth your interest, like this flower today. Once you noticed its color and the fact that it was growing, you dismissed it. It was sissy. A magnificent creation like a flower is definitely not sissy. When I showed you the flower under the microscope, you learned that there was a whole new dimension to it." "What's a dimension?" Lindy asked. "In this case, it means going one step beyond what you already see or know. Finding another world, one that has been there all along, just waiting for you to discover it." "Like Wangdoodle Land?" she said. "Is that a dimension?" "In a way, yes. My point is this. I don't want you ever again to take something at face value, to take things for granted. Let your curiosity run away with you. Know that beyond every ordinary explanation, there is a deeper and more exciting discovery to be made." There was a knock on the door, and Mrs. Primrose entered. "Tea is ready, sir." "Fine," said the professor. "Then that will end our lesson for today. Tomorrow we are going to go on a picnic, so bring your bicycles. Also, you should dress in weatherproof clothes because it is going to rain." "How on earth do you know that?" Tom asked. The professor rumpled the boy's hair. "I'm a scientist, Thomas, and I also heard the weather forecast on the radio." They all laughed and clattered downstairs to tea. That evening, the children were elated. Lindy especially was keyed up. Her powers of concentration had been put to good use that afternoon. By dinner time, she was so excited she was almost unable to eat. Mrs. Potter tried not to show her concern. "Lindy, dear, don't just stare at your plate. Eat your stew and dumplings." "It's not stew, and they're not dumplings," she said. "It's a brown land with mountains, and the dumplings are sponges, white sponges that will suck you up if you go too near to them." "What's this? What are you talking about?" Mr. Potter gave his daughter a keen glance. "No, not sponges," Lindy changed her mind. "They're giant boulders, and I wish I were small enough to climb one." Mrs. Potter said, "I think this afternoon has been a little too much for you. You're being very silly." "It's not silly, Mum. Look at the peas on my plate. Don't they look like tiny green stones? Like when you're at the seaside and the beach is all pebbles?" They just look like peas to me," replied Mrs. Potter. "I think you all need an early night tonight." As Lindy was preparing for bed, Tom knocked on the door of her room. "Lindy, can I come in?" "What do you want, Tom?" "Here's the quarter that I owe you." He put it on her bedside table. Lindy examined the 25-cent piece. "Thanks. But you don't really need to give this to me. I mean, do you want it back?" Tom was surprised and he thought about it for a moment. "No," he said. "You won it fairly, and besides, if you hadn't gone to Stonehouse, we'd never have met the professor." She smiled at him. "Tell you what, I won't ever spend it. I'll just keep it to remind me of Halloween. It'll be my lucky piece from now on." In a rare show of affection for his sister, Tom patted her on the shoulder. Okay, well, good night," he said. "Good night, Tom." Lindy slowly removed her slippers and bathrobe. She pulled her curtains and brushed her teeth, and then climbed into her comfortable brass bed. She lay back against the pillows and thought about the afternoon and how wonderful it had been. She thought about the professor and Sneezewort and the incredible microscope. Soon she began to drift into sleep. Through half-closed eyes, she gazed at the curtains pulled across her window. They were pretty curtains, printed with flowers of the countryside, red and orange poppies, white and yellow daisies, and blue cornflowers. Lindy thought, as she often did, how nice it would be to walk in a field filled with flowers like that. The curtains moved slightly. She stretched out a hand to touch the flowers, which seemed almost within her grasp. When Mrs. Potter came upstairs to say goodnight to her daughter, she found her already asleep, smiling peacefully, and with one hand open on the coverlet. She was reaching out to those flowers. I challenge you, my friends, to notice things you've never noticed before. See you for chapter 6.